Hey everybody, it's Krista and this is Bad at Keeping Secrets. I am really delighted today to introduce you, if you don't already know, Kate Folk and her work. We're talking about Out There. This is her first collection of short stories, and it originated off of the title essay is called Out There, and it was originally for a New Yorker article. Is that right? You're
Yeah.
you were a Stegner Fellow. You live in the Bay Area. I'm assuming you studied English and writing in school, even though I couldn't really find it anywhere. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. In undergrad, I had like a liberal arts major, kind of interdisciplinary, but mostly English and creative writing, history, that kind of thing.
So I was really excited to talk to you. I want to talk to you about sci-fi and this moment. I want to talk to you about gender. I want to talk to you about loneliness, misconnections, expectations. This book, I feel like, was basically written for me in terms of my interests. I love thinking about intimacy and relationships, but I also think there's this sort of like magical realism edge to it. And it answers sort of like a what if. I kind of want to start with asking you a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into this, because I think for a lot of, or for a recent time period, I've really felt like if early exposure and what your parents do sort of dictate without us knowing what sort of we're interested in and where we go in life. And I was just wondering if you could talk about your childhood a little bit.
Yeah, so I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, and I'm an only child, and I feel like I always loved to read and write stories. Like even before I could write, I would kind of dictate them to my mom or like preschool teachers or whatever, and illustrate what they had written down and that kind of thing. And my parents were both like big storytellers too and big readers, and so I think that definitely shaped my interest in reading and writing like from a really early age. And even just like my stuffed rabbit, Peter, who I had and was like really attached to, as a kid. My parents would come up with all these really elaborate, wonderful stories about him, and like he would talk, he had a voice and all of that. And so, and actually to this day, they still report on like Peter occurrences. He still has kind of a life in the world. And I think that the sort of permeability between like reality and fiction, I think has always been a thing for me. Like I can really believe in like the dream of fiction. To the extent where it does really feel real, and it's hard to to fully accept that it's just completely made up. And yeah, so I I started writing stories then basically as soon as I could, and I read a lot. Like the first thing that I really started reading were like the Babysitter's Club books.
I
When
remember
I
this.
first learned to read, yeah, and I read like all of them, like the entire series. I think there were like 180 books at the time or something, to the point where my teacher like told me that I had to read real books or like better books, and I was extremely offended by that. But yeah, so I always loved to read and also watch TV. Like I watched a lot of TV growing up, which I feel like also kind of shaped my interests and sense of humor and all of that. Like The Simpsons and Seinfeld and all these sitcoms and talk shows and all of that. I feel like I was consuming a lot of that content from an early age. So yeah, and then when I went to college, I wanted to study writing, and I did a bit, but I also felt like it maybe wasn't the most practical thing to study, and I didn't really know what like a career path would look like with writing. Obviously, I knew I could be an author, but that didn't really seem like a feasible goal at the time. So I did take some writing classes, but kind of hedge my bets by taking other classes too. And writing was something that I couldn't like stay away from though. I kept coming back to it, and it was kind of obvious it was what I wanted to do. It was just a matter of investing in it and kind of taking myself seriously with it. And that only happened like over the years, and even going back to get an MFA, and then after the MFA, like writing on my own and submitting to journals and that kind of thing, and like building up um, a bio of publications, and also like building up more of a tolerance to rejection and that kind of thing. So yeah.
I think that's huge, this tolerance to rejection. Would you say, I used to tell myself that like I had to be rejected like at least 60 times for one acceptance. Uh, and I don't think we really like, I never acknowledged how important that would be in sort of being steadfast and wanting to do it. I also think that like being a writer, there's not, I feel like there in other professions, potentially there's like a clear path to how it works, but I feel like everybody kind of comes to being an artist. I would put writers and artists maybe under the same umbrella, that there's actually pretty clear paths you can take, and that formulas like they're very doable in ways that I feel like people don't acknowledge, and they seem like unpractical. But I actually would argue that like having an English degree is pretty practical in that people want people who can communicate. Like communication is such a vital skill. I want to kind of talk about, can we talk about Out There and the inspiration? Maybe if you could summarize Out There, the first article of the book, for people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so the book is a story collection, and there's 15 stories, and the first story and the last story both take place in the same world where there's these blots who are basically like fake men, like these biomorphic AI men who are created for a nefarious purpose, basically to target lonely women on dating apps and seduce them and take them to Big Sur for a beautiful weekend, and then
Still their
and
data.
then
Sorry.
yeah, and you know, where there's no service in Big Sur, and so in the middle of the night they steal all of the woman's data and vaporize in a cloud of lavender scented mist, and so the first story Out There actually takes place chronologically like after the final story, because the final story Big Sur is also about the blots and kind of a love story between a blot and a woman. But yeah, the first story, which appeared in the New Yorker in 2020, is about kind of after the news of the blots has broken. Everyone knows about them and knows that they're a risk, and so online dating is kind of even more stigmatized, especially for women, because it's like, why would you be trying to date men on these apps? You know that, you know, the men on the apps are 50% blots these days, and so it's kind of just a new level of risk to pile on to the risk that was already there for women using the apps. And so I guess when I first thought of the idea, I think was in like late 2016, and I was using dating apps myself, and you know, and I've used like online dating and the apps like on and off for years, like whenever I've been single. Not always because I felt enthusiastic about it, but just because, like in the story, you know, she says like, this is what people do these days, like this is what you have to do to find someone. And I think, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think there is a certain pressure of like, oh, if I'm single, I have to be on the apps, or it means I don't really want to find a connection because I'm not putting myself out there, I'm not trying. So but I would be in this position where I was maybe like not really wanting to date men from the apps. Like I would be kind of going through the motions and swiping a lot and having these surface level conversations, but I wasn't invested in the project so much. I was just kind of going through the motions of it. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of people, because there's a whole range, obviously, of motivations people have for like using a dating app. Like maybe they just want a hookup, or maybe they just want to talk to someone, or they just want a little validation, or they want a real relationship. You know, it could be like any different thing, and all of those are fine, I think. But yeah, I guess my own kind of disaffection with that and feeling like I was having the same conversations over and over again, and not really meeting people in real life either. So it was kind of just like they were not fully embodied humans in a way. And I was thinking, I was getting a lot of like spam emails at the same time, and you know, like scam calls and all of these scams everywhere. And so I was thinking like, if some of these men that I was talking to on the apps were actually like bots or some kind of scammer, I probably wouldn't know the difference and it wouldn't really matter because it was kind of giving me the same like validation that I was looking for, whether it was real or fake. And so I just thought that was kind of a funny idea. Like, what if one of these catfish or spam bots like came to life in the form of an actual apparent human, and how that would just introduce this new layer of uh, intrigue and terror to to like meeting someone from the internet because you don't know if they're actually even a real person.
I think there was the riding the line of what, because so much of it was so relatable. And if correct me if I miss any details, but in the beginning, you sort of talk about what's the protagonist's name in Out There? Do we know their name?
Yeah, we don't know actually. She doesn't have one.
But she meets
Yeah.
Roger. Roger is the blot that she meets, right? At the dinner.
Yeah, yeah.
And she's sort of dissatisfied with Roger. And then she meets someone who is kind of writing this line, you don't really know it. It becomes sort of like a detective story in some ways, in that is it Sam?
Yeah.
And to try to figure out if he's a human or a blot. And then in the end, I won't really spoil it, but it's ambiguous what she wants or what her motivations are. And I think that speaks to something really deep inside of me, this sort of binary between wanting an idealized version of a relationship, but also wanting it to be real. And I think we're living in this moment that we can have both the possibility of having, I don't know. I guess my question is, for you, was it important to make are you trying to make a statement, and maybe you don't have to be making a statement on sort of the expectations that we place on other people to sort of fulfill us?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's maybe what some people don't quite understand when they read that story, was that I wasn't intending it to be like, oh, Sam sucks and he's so disappointing and he's, just a disappointing man or whatever. Like there is definitely that element, like he is that, but I also wanted it to be like the narrator is also disappointing in this way, or she kind of um is not like too picky, but yeah, maybe she's like expecting too much. She's expecting it to be that kind of like passion and fireworks all the time. And maybe she isn't. Maybe there's something that's like not quite resolved within her where she is actually able to have a relationship that's just like accepting a person with all their flaws and kind of navigating just the boring day to day with someone that is so much of a relationship. And also the fact that the narrator is in recovery, like she's a recovering addict or alcoholic. I think that also factors into kind of her dissatisfaction or her desire to kind of fill some need within herself, and also her like mistrust of her own instincts with dating. Like she isn't sure if like she likes Sam or not, or even if she doesn't like Sam, like can she trust that? And I think that's also part of what makes it really maddening, especially with online dating, where it's like people who we don't necessarily have any like organic connection to, like we don't have friends in common and that kind of thing, so we don't really have any context for them except for like their bio. And then when we meet them in person, and it's always kind of trying to figure out like, is this person, is there something really like really wrong with this person, is there some big red flag, or it's kind of like starting from scratch in a way that it wouldn't be if we had people who vouched for them or something like that,
It really makes me think of Shakespeare's sonnet. It's like sonnet number 16. Is that the one where he's like, I think it starts with like, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. But yet he goes, I mean, for the first bit of it, it's about how ordinary this woman is. But at the end, it sort of loops back on how much he loves her. And we're brought up, I feel like I was brought up on this notion that we deserved the perfect partner, and we were on this hunt for the perfect person. And so there's these conflicting ideas about love and needs and fulfillment that I feel like are really beautiful in out there. But I also think this when you talk about mistrust in instincts, I think that that's really poignant and really descriptive of this moment. I think in other generations and maybe other time periods, and or maybe it's just me, that there's this acknowledgement that our instincts aren't always right because of, I think, big data and also other studies in academia. And I was wondering if you could talk about if there's something in you, like if you trust your instincts, or what the role of kind of trusting your gut is in writing and also in life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I've come to trust my instincts more, I think, as I get older and more stable, I guess. And after I've made more mistakes and understood how I felt when I made this decision, and or if I reacted maybe too quickly, or maybe rejected something because I was scared, or there was some kind of immediate repulsion that maybe I shouldn't have trusted, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think I meditate a lot. Like I meditate twice a day for 20 minutes. And I think that that's helped me kind of clear away some of that chatter in my head. Just being able to be still and kind of not think about anything. But yeah, I think with writing, it's so important, that intuition and tapping into that like creative brain, because I do feel like our creative mind is like smarter than our regular brain in so many ways. Like, and it can be really hard to tap into too. And I feel like everyone who does any kind of creative endeavor understands that feeling of being in that like flow state, where it does feel like things are happening almost without our interference, and it's such a magical place. And for me, it's very elusive too. Like and there's a lot, I think, that gets in the way in my ego and my laziness. But I don't know if it's laziness, or if it's just like a resistance to failing, or a resistance to doing something that feels hard and that I might not succeed at. So yeah, I don't know if that's what you were asking, but I feel like this is something that I'm concerned about in my writing practice now, is getting past those like filters and just kind of doing it until that flow state takes over eventually, which it doesn't always. But
Can we talk a little bit about the intelligence of the creative brain and what that looks like, and why we should value it? Because I mean, I think about this a lot, that I think when I went to school, there was this notion that you could overthinking was the path to something that would be quote unquote smart. But I think as I age, and also when I have like really paid attention to the things that I enjoy in my practice, that again, going back to that flow state, is something where I really appreciate tapping into this like subconscious, or also the limitless. Like I feel like in some ways our thinking brain knows what it knows, but then we get this sort of expansive knowledge when we use the creative brain. I guess my question is, what does that look like for you? And what is that? How would you define the intelligence of the creative brain?
yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of like writing fiction, I think that like for me, it's never worked to outline ahead of time. It's never worked to kind of think about the themes of what I want the work to be too much ahead of time. I mean, I can have like a vague idea, but if I'm trying to like communicate a message through a story, it usually feels flat and doesn't really come across. But if I just kind of start writing, it feels like all of that arises naturally from the work. And I'll even like go back and find that there are already these like thematic resonances that I hadn't put in intentionally, but that or just they just kind of belong. Yeah. And so that must come from the subconscious, right? Because I'm not deliberately doing it. But it's in me somewhere. And I also feel like, you know, writing is so much about revision. And I think revision is the most important thing about kind of getting to the next stage as a writer for most writers, and for me definitely. But at the same time, like now I'm writing a novel, and it's changed a lot, and I think gotten a lot better, and now it's like a full draft and everything. Over the years I've been working on it, but when I look back on like my very first attempt at writing like the first chapter, it's amazing like how much is the same, just about the components and kind of the voice and the setup, and even where I felt the plot moving. So I think there is also something to like first drafts and kind of the raw draft and the energy of that. And oftentimes like the components of what a story is meant to be are contained within that first draft, and it's just a matter of, you know, yeah, figuring out how to best express that, and get it across. But
if you wouldn't, can we talk about a couple more of the stories in Out There? I really want something that there were a bunch of things that kind of stuck with me, and I might ask you if it's possible to read just a couple lines. But I think let's start with The Void Wife. Can you give us a brief, because I think you'll do a better job than I will in terms of summarizing the story, but it feels like we're in there right now.
yeah, so The Void Wife, I mean, I guess you could call it an apocalyptic story, but it's about there's a void that's consuming the earth at, I forget what the exact rate is, but like at a slow and steady pace every day. Kind of like two eyelids like drawing over the earth slowly. And so there's this curtain of void that draws near and just absorbs everything it touches, and all of that is negated and no longer exists. And so soon the earth will just not exist at all. And when people figure out that this is happening, it's a lot of people just kind of submit to it and think like, okay, this is what's happening. And there's also this rumor that the people that you're touching at the moment, you're absorbed by the void, or the people you'll be with for eternity. And so it becomes this kind of religious type thing, right? Like people are willingly going into the void with the people they love. And but then the protagonist of the story doesn't buy into it and thinks that these people are all just being stupid. Basically, they're buying into this fairy tale about the void, and the void just leads to death like anything else. And so she's trying to run from it and cling to existence as long as she can. And so the story kind of shows her doing that at first with her boyfriend, but then he goes to the void, and so then she's like on her own, and she's dating this kind of unappealing guy so that she can get on a cruise ship to you know, spend the last few months of existence at sea while the void closes around the Pacific Ocean. So yeah, so it is, I mean, I think it's like a funny story though too, and about, you know, what do we do in the face of big existential crises, I guess, like maybe there's a corollary to climate change and the threats we face now. But yeah, just this idea about like the kind of human reaction to something like that that's just unfathomable. Like, do we just kind of submit and say, okay, this is how it is, or do we fight for some shred of, you know, existence still among that, even when all hope is kind of lost? So
It feels very much, I remember last week when I was reading it, I also felt like last week I decided to make this change, in this major life change, where in which I don't look at the news the first thing in the morning, because it felt very much like that void. And did we run for it, or do we just stay and keep going the day to day? And it really, I think for me, brings into question like, what if you're like the protagonist and you don't believe in this afterlife, or this story that we'll get to spend eternity in the void with the people that we love or the people that we're touching, what what is the point? And I think it's lovely that there are different people, like the things that she settles for, like dating or being with someone she doesn't really want, just to keep going. And I was wondering, I like do you see any sort of connections between religion and sci-fi, or like the ability to kind of create these alternate futures that sort of satiate particular needs?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I feel like even thinking about like Frankenstein and how that's like literally like playing God, like creating Dr. Frankenstein, like creating life, and that's similar to like the blots, right? And that kind of thing. And yeah, there's a show that was on HBO called Raised by Wolves that it got canceled after like 2 seasons, but it was really good. It was like a sci-fi show, like a Ridley Scott production, and it was about this like futuristic moment where there's been this huge war on Earth between like these believers and the atheists, and so basically they have to go and resettle this new planet because Earth is ruined, and the atheists send these like cyborgs or androids, I guess, like ahead of them with like embryos of humans to be born and like repopulate this new planet. So I feel like that, yeah, that's kind of tackling these ideas about like spirituality and God and belief in a really interesting way that maybe I don't know if just like realist fiction could get at it in quite that way, like definitely in other ways, but I do think that sci-fi has this potential to kind of take fears or longings that are inside us and like blow it up to this big scale with big stakes so that we can kind of look at it in a new way.
Do you think, what elements do you think of out there do you feel like will, or potentially, what do you think has the most potential to become an actuality?
Um,
Sorry
yeah,
for the silly
probably
question.
no, probably the blots, I would say. I mean, that seems like with all the stuff about AI in the news recently, it's just like, I mean, I see these articles constantly about like, and my friends like send me every article too about especially romance oriented AIs. Like there was one apparently like a woman like left her husband for a chatbot recently or something, and um so it does seem like as soon as they're able to do that technologically, they will be, you know.
I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but would you?
Would I date a blot?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't. Mm,
Sorry,
maybe,
I like
maybe
to.
like maybe short term. I feel like it would be hard to fully commit to like a artificial person as a life partner, I think. Maybe that's just my, you know, my small-minded, like old-fashioned mindset that I wouldn't have a satisfying life with like a fake human, but maybe it'll be different in, 50 years. People will have different feelings about it, but I don't know.
No, I agree with you. I think that there's something inside of me that is tethering me to quote unquote what real is, or this concept of um having actually experienced something as being interesting and having value. This reminds me of the story Tahoe, where you sort of, you really deal with memory and trauma and time and also relationships within the recounting of this. It's a horror story in so many ways. Can you tell us what happens in Tahoe? And maybe let's talk about how it's an illustration of how memory works, or maybe what you were trying to talk about in terms of memory.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So that Tahoe is about it's just like a voice-driven story of this man who's kind of recounting this bachelor party weekend in Tahoe some years ago. He can't remember exactly when or a lot of the details about it. And it's very circular, like he's kind of circling around something, but not kind of telling us what it is at first, but trying to remember these kind of mundane details about like, oh, who was getting married, and like um did we rent you know, snowmobiles or ATVs or whatever. It's like all these details that aren't kind of like the real thing, and then it finally circles around to this the heart of what happened that weekend, which is that they killed a man basically who had was threatening them, or so they thought, and uh, and dumped his body in Lake Tahoe. And so, and then he kind of immediately, you know, diverts from that again, and so talks about like the breakfast that they made the next morning, and like, oh, I think Jim made the pancakes, and so did this and that, and so yeah, and I think it was definitely intended as like an exploration of memory and the way that our memory is fictional basically, and we're kind of um you know, it's like I always have this feeling that every time I remember something, it's like a degraded copy of the original memory, right? And it's almost like some moments I try not to think about too much, because I feel like if I do, then I'll be
Right.
remembering the memory, or it'll be like a, you know, like a copy that's faded over time.
What's the term
And
for that? Do you remember?
I
Sorry.
don't know. I know I'm sure there is a term, right?
Uh,
Um,
when I've read about it, or I feel like that, um, or maybe it was a TED talk I watched about how memory worked and how the transition,
mm,
how the thread of the memory sort of um evolves over time to be further apart from the
mhm.
actual event. Um, I think for me, when I read Tahoe, there's also this other people's perceptions, because in the end, there's the twist of the, do you know? Is there ever any way to know actually what happened?
No, I mean, I don't know, certainly. Maybe that guy does in the story. um, yeah, I mean, I think it's also about kind of the inability to face something like a trauma, basically, or in this case, something that he inflicted on another person, something that he probably feels guilty for. Like he's only able to remember it or approach it from this kind of oblique angle, and with a lot of parts missing, right? But he is kind of admitting to it, but then he's like moving on right away and focusing on something else instead. And I felt like that was very true to maybe how we remember like things that we've done in our past that we aren't quite ready to look at.
I think like another thing that really I enjoyed is throughout the book, there are these sort of moments that of reflection or evaluation that sort of naturally, because the writing is so relatable and the situations are so akin to what I've been experiencing recently, that they sort of filter into making evaluations of my own relationships and my life. There's one in particular I'm thinking of that I think was in I think it's the shelter one about the
Yeah, shelter. Yeah.
where I think she talks about how she reflects on her relationship right now, with the idea of like, would she still find the partner that she has, that she ended up with, attractive, or be drawn to them in a room full of people, which I don't know why I keep focusing on this sort of what if, but in that story, I think you weave together, she's a writer for a porn website living in rural Iowa, and there's a sort of safe house in the basement that she eventually sort of takes residence in. And I was wondering if you could talk about how the sort of tangents, not tangents, but the different layers of loneliness and being trapped sort of parallel each other in the human experience.
Yeah, that story is funny. It's that is inspired by an actual room in my parents' basement, this
Oh,
shelter that yeah, like we moved into that house when I was in like sixth grade, and like out in the country, and in the basement there was this room that was like concrete walls, and it had like a metal door like for an outdoor door, and it locked. I think it locks from the outside though. In the story, it locks from the inside, which is like a creepy factor. But the fact that it locks from the outside is kind of even weirder because it was like, are you locking someone in there, or what was the point of? But we figured it was actually just a tornado shelter, which actually there was like a huge tornado last week, and my parents had to go down there. But I was always really intrigued by it because it was so creepy. And yeah, I felt like in that story, it's like this woman and her boyfriend, they've been living in San Francisco, and then they get evicted because the owner buys the building or whatever. So they get a payout, and they're kind of ready to leave anyway, which I feel like is this familiar experience in San Francisco. Like, oh, how long am I going to stay? Like, maybe it'd be better to go somewhere that feels more affordable and all of that. And so yeah, they're in this house in the country in Iowa, and the main character Reese like doesn't know anyone around there, and her boyfriend is always he's recording an album with his band like in town or whatever, and so she's just alone all day with her job writing copy for this like BDSM porn website, and then the shelter below her, and kind of her fixation, her spiraling like obsession with this shelter and what might be inside it because it's inexplicably locked one day. So yeah, I mean, I felt like for that, it's kind of like, yeah, it starts with that uncanny moment of looking at her boyfriend like across the kitchen, and not recognizing him. Like they've been together long enough that they've kind of both gotten older, and she's almost like seeing him for a moment as if he's a stranger, and like would she be attracted to him if they met now, and if she didn't know anything about him. And then she's just alone for the rest of the day, and she's doing this job that like in a way is kind of intense because she's watching very intense like sex, and then writing descriptions of it, but it's also it has kind of all of uh, the humanity kind of stripped away from it because it's just her job, and it's also it's actors like performing, and even the sequences in like the porn videos are very formulaic, and she kind of has like hashtags or whatever that she uses, or metadata. So yeah, and I feel like a lot of the characters in the book, like she is kind of looking for something real, like something that transcends that surface level, um, like, and not just sex, but something that feels like deeper, and something that will really like penetrate her soul kind of. And in a way, she's almost looking to the mystery of the shelter as that thing. It's this like unknowable thing that she feels like if she could just figure it out or get into that shelter, maybe she would find some like fulfillment, or somehow it feels like that's more real than like her relationship and her job and all of these things that have become very rote and mundane.
do you think
So
do you think I'm selfishly asking this. Do you think she wants to be found?
um yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's like it kind of like the beauty of her final gesture, which is kind of like entombing herself in the shelter, is that it's like an act of surrender. Again, it's like um kind of submitting to whatever happens either way, and um whether she's found or not, that's kind of like not up to her anymore. So I feel like there's kind of a spiritual aspect to that too, of like giving up control, and um yeah, I guess it's a dark ending for sure.
I mean, I don't know if it had to be dark.
Yeah.
I could see there a being an awakening and an aliveness of being found, and also that in the idea of letting go. I mean, that both could be really dark, but also both, I mean, by vantage point, I think change. I was also, I think the last one I want to talk to you about, because we're super out of time, but the head growing out of the floor.
Yeah,
What is that one
the head
called?
on the floor.
The head in the
The
floor.
head on the floor, yeah.
I think it was, for me, I don't know if you were, I mean, maybe it's, I never know if it's obvious, the things that I get out of things, or if it's intentional or something that everybody gets, but it seemed very much like a reflection of what both literally having a child come out of the floor, or a person come out of the floor, and also very descriptive of how relationships sort of change, and what people, how circumstances inevitably bring people together and make them stay.
Yeah, because in that story, she's she lives in an apartment, and then a head starts growing out of her floor very slowly, and she's single, and she alludes to maybe not having been a good person in the past, and like a lot of people don't like her, and so she doesn't really have anyone in the beginning to deal with this head coming out of the floor problem with, and she's kind of going back through her phone and texting guys who she like dated or maybe went on one date with in the past, and having these guys come over thinking that it's like a date, but it's actually just she just wants someone to help with this like horrifying problem of the head coming out of her floor. And eventually she does find a guy who's kind of willing to just be in that with her and stay while the head slowly grows out of her floor. Um yeah, it's like a very, I guess it's like an absurdist kind of ending, right? Because I feel like we're expecting the head to keep growing out of the floor, and she does too, right? She thinks like soon it'll be a whole man out of the floor until like he'll like say hello and like walk out the door, and that'll be the end of it. And I won't have to tell my landlord about it. But instead, the head just kind of stops, like at the level like just under the eyes, and is just stuck there. And so they just kind of put a towel over it and try not to think about it. And at that point, the guy has kind of moved in, and but she says that they've never touched each other, and so it is like very unsettling and comic, I guess, right? Because it's like, I guess they have been bonded by the head coming out of the floor, but it's not necessarily like a fulfilling bond. It's more just like someone to have by your side while life throws its horrors at you, kind of thing. Which in a way, I guess, is what a relationship is, but hopefully more than that too.
I really love the way you say that. Someone to be bonded to while life throws you its horrors. Because I mean, it seems like we've all been through a lot in the past, I don't know, since life, I don't know, the past couple of years. It's been pretty intense, but also if I think about it in the greater scheme, it also seems quite horrifying. Can you talk a little bit about, like, upon reflecting about the book and writing the collection of short stories, if you can kind of surmise or take stock of your creative intelligence and what that's sort of saying from like a feminist perspective and gender roles and expectations?
Yeah, I think the stories in the book, I feel like, belong to kind of an era of my writing when I had like a recurring fixations, right? There's a lot of kind of body horror, a lot of like haunted houses in a way, or houses that seem to have some kind of sentience, and um, and yeah, a lot of kind of stories about women who are maybe in unsatisfying relationships or feeling disaffected, and yeah, and I think that hopefully now I'm moving on to something new, although I think my sensibility will still be in there. But I think maybe there's always been something that feels like confining about you know, like being a woman in society or whatever, to me, like the kind of dating roles and like and dating men, and there is something performative about it all, right? Or something where I feel like I've felt in the past like I'm kind of following a script, and I don't necessarily buy into the script, but it seems like the easiest thing to do, like with dating, and I think that's kind of true for all of human interaction in a way. Like obviously we have these scripts and like customs and all of that, but I remember when I was younger and I would like when I was first starting to go on like actual dates with men, it just felt so like gross to me. Like and probably just because I was like 19 or something, and it felt very fake. Like if a guy was actually trying to be like chivalrous or something, or like pay for dinner, or like open the door and that kind of thing, and I'd be like, ugh, like what a turn off. It's awful. And then as I've grown older now, I like that stuff. But then I'm like, well, why do I like that stuff now? Is it because I've somehow, you know, learned to equate that with something bigger about how much someone is like respecting me? Or I don't know, there's so much like cultural baggage around everything to do with like dating and gender roles and that kind of thing. So in a way, like people might question whether they're feminist because a lot of them involve women kind of surrendering themselves or submitting to annihilation in some way. But I was thinking of it as kind of like empowering in a perverse way, I guess, of like kind of opting out or just like finding realness like on their own terms, even if it means like their own destruction in some way, or destruction and rebirth kind of thing.
I
So
definitely, I definitely didn't think in any way that it was not a feminist or a pro. I think when I think about when I evaluate what can fall under the umbrella of feminist or womanist, I think that unfortunately for me, and I think that maybe you might take issue with this, or one might take issue with, I think going up being, there's something about self-advocacy and being able to make choices within the, again, the sort of confining nature of existence that I think is inherently, I have to respect, even if it's a different choice than I would make. Because I can't assume that I would know the right thing or the right answer for everyone, because oftentimes I obviously don't have access to their existence or their memory and their existence in ways that I think are important contextual information that that I don't have. Again, it's always so specific, but can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now, and what's sort of inspiring you to keep going at the moment?
yeah, I'm working on a novel, like I said, and I feel like I shouldn't say much about it at this point because it's still kind of in that stage, but I've been working on it for like 4 years and I'm excited about it. So hopefully that will pan out. And I think it has some of the same themes as the book, but it is very different from the book, and it's like first person and very much a character study. And so yeah, and I've also been working on developing a TV adaptation of the Blot stories from out there, so that those first and last stories, and so that's still in the works. So we'll see what happens with that.
I have
That's
one
exciting.
last, I have one last question for you.
Sure.
And this is again, maybe potentially, a few months ago, I interviewed Susan Cain, who wrote Bittersweet. And I've been thinking a lot about like what draws people to the media that they consume and enjoy. And I was wondering, I took a lot of delight in reading the short story collection. And I was wondering if you could, if you have some theory on what it is that draws people to sort of not necessarily sadness and uncertainty, because but also possibilities of different realities, or what sort of need is that fulfilling, I think, inside of us?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that like we were talking about the subconscious earlier, and like the human subconscious is like so deeply weird. And if you think about like the dreams we have and that kind of thing, like they're very disturbing. And watching like David Lynch movies or like Twin Peaks The Return, it was like it has I love like cultural products that have that quality of being like so disturbing because they feel like true in a way. They feel like we can recognize something in them, or there's kind of like the surface of everyday reality, but we can have this sense that there's something lurking underneath it, or maybe that we can't know fully what's going on. Like we're like biological beings that have a certain type of brain, and we can't understand the way the universe works really at all. And so I think there is that innate like curiosity about like the dark underbelly of whatever we're looking at. And kind of like the brighter the surface and more cheerful the surface, the more sinister it seems, right? Because we feel like there has to be that flip side of it. And yeah, I feel like just at this moment in history too, with like the climate crisis and all the other crises, and also with technology being so advanced now and kind of going into this realm that is like a sci-fi realm, right? But it's becoming reality. I think that people are searching for that in fiction too, because it can feel like the more realist or kind of straightforward types of narratives also are really important, right? But it seems like we also want the next thing, or we want to like look forward a little bit into seeing some of that weirdness like reflected through fiction. So I think it is a good time for speculative fiction and sci-fi. I think that it makes sense that a lot of people are gravitating toward it. I mean, I don't feel like I can't even really call myself a true sci-fi writer. I don't think, I'm more in this like realm of like literary sci-fi, which is kind of its own thing. And it's definitely a lot of people are writing in that mode for now. But
Do you think of
yeah,
this?
sorry, go
I
ahead.
think of this because also, I mean, this also feels, even though it's not like a direct, this also feels very memoir-esque,
Mm,
I guess. And thinking about, like, if I think about it in the context of the Tahoe story and how memory works, it's interesting to me how what the lines are between your, I don't know, there's so many questions. And I feel like for me, that what I get out of it is this, like, I can't watch like Tarantino, or there are lots of horror. I'm really not drawn to the genre of horror. I've tried, and it's only gotten worse as I've gotten older. But there's something about the coupling of the sort of mundane everyday with this sort of extreme extremities and sort of sinister underbelly, as you say. It's really satisfying. And I feel like there's some sort of, it's uncovering some sort of deep truth that I've been kind of denying or not letting myself indulge in. And so thank you so much, Kate, for doing this, for
of
talking
course.
and for also exploring these topics. Kind of, it really rides the line of, because there are very much moments, like sexual moments or dark moments, that I think need to be acknowledged and explored and unpacked. And I feel like it takes bravery to go there. So again, everybody, Kate Folk, she wrote Out There, and we'll be looking forward to the TV show and also your upcoming novel. Thank you again for doing this with me.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
My pleasure.